Hey, everybody. It is Saturday afternoon. I hope you're all doing well out there. And today I want another sort of live stream. Feel free to jump in the chat if you're out there and watching and say hi. But today I was just going to riff on something I've been thinking about for a while. And to be honest, I haven't completely parsed it out. Um, but maybe this will help sort of solidify some of the things I'm thinking. But it basically stems from what I notice with a lot of ISFPs. It was coming in interacting with a lot of ISFPs. I I've been in the music business for a long time, and I represented artists and musicians, and so I come across a lot of ISFPs. Um, and because they tend to be really good artists, and we'll talk about that in a second why that might be. But I had always noticed with the ISFPs that if you ask any ISFP um, whether or not they think they're intuitive, just in a general sense, not necessarily an MBTI sense, but just like, you know, do you believe you have strong intuition? Like almost to a person, they will tell you that they believe that they're very intuitive. Um, and I think maybe for good reason, which we'll get into. But it always sort of I wouldn't really say struck me as odd, but it was noticeable. Um, and but they were clearly, to me at least, ISFPs, not INFPs or any other sort of intuitive. Um, and so it just sort of got me thinking about the third function, because with an ISFP, and this is an important point, is that their third function is going to be introverted intuition. And so because of that, and also just sort of my general experience with my third function, introverted thinking, I've always sort of thought of myself as a thinker, right? And I think in the same way, if you ask an ISFP if they consider themselves intuitive, I think with most INFJs, if you ask them, do you consider yourself logical or a thinker, and again, maybe not in MBTI sense, but just in general, and just sort of the general understanding of what it means to be sort of logical or rational, or a quote unquote thinker, I think most INFJs will sort of fancy themselves as being logical thinking, because they do have that introverted thinking in their third function. And I think that's driving a lot of it. And then what to take from all of this, I think, is that um, when people are typing themselves, especially, taking online tests and sort of answering questions where they're sort of doing this self-assessment of whether or not they think they're a thinker or a feeler, answering questions that are getting at that. I think that's probably the thing that skews the results the most, is that whatever, and here's sort of the theory for the thing that I'm working with here, is whatever your third function is, you tend to um, maybe it's sort of overrepresented in how you think of yourself. And not only that, but you might sort of identify with it in a way that you might not identify with any of the other functions, right? So again, if you go to an ISFP and you ask, I mean, even if you were just to say, hey, describe yourself in 5 words or less, I wouldn't be surprised if a large number of them would just spontaneously come up with, I'm intuitive, or, I'm um, sort of a not necessarily kind of a deep intuitive thinker, not in sort of the logical sense that we usually think of as thinking, but as sort of, that they just sort of have deep inner thoughts, right? in sort of the Jungian way of or the Buddhist way of describing thoughts. So okay, let's sort of parse this out, and maybe it'll make some sense of it. Um, okay, so you got your third function, and in the socionics world, it's sort of seen as the kind of a selfish function, like you use it for yourself as opposed to um, sort of putting it out there for others. Maybe it's and I would argue, especially if it's sort of an introverted function, you really tie it to yourself. Um, and then also because your polar function is going to be sort of the opposite direction of whatever your third function is, right? So if your third function is introverted thinking, your polar function is going to be extroverted thinking. Or if your third function is introverted intuition, your polar function is going to be extroverted intuition. And to a degree, those introverted and extroverted functions sort of keep each other in check in a way. Um, and when you're polar in one of them, whatever's in your third function is probably not going to be in check as much. And I'm going to give you some details about some observations about the ISFPs and where I'm coming from that. Um, okay, and and how these different functions, how you're when you're missing your polar or when you're not really missing your polar function, but when you have a polar function, it's not keeping your third function in check as much, right? And so I think it sort of leads people to sort of self-identify with that function more so than all the other functions that aren't their dominant function. Okay, so I was watching our friends over at Talk Book, right? I think that's the name of the channel. The MBT, it's the site where they do a bunch of MBTI sort of breakdowns on some popular people out there. And I went on this whole ISFP kick, ISFP rabbit hole, and it got me thinking of this sort of third function theory, because what they do a good what the site does a good job of pointing out is that the ISFPs, they tend to have this very dramatic way of coming, presenting themselves. They're sort of the MBTI's drama queens, right? They sort of over embellish everything. They tend to be um, focused on, I mean, certainly focused on their feelings. And the way I describe them is they're kind of in their own little bubble, right? And coincidentally, a video of Machine Gun Kelly, who's clearly in my book an ISFP, and that's the way um, Typebook types him as well. Um, so this video of him and Drew Barrymore, he was on Drew Barrymore's talk show, and it came up, and he sort of represents a lot of ISFPs out there, and Kurt Cobain was mentioned as being another one, and Kelly's wife, Megan Kelly, which we'll talk about in a second. That's an interesting phenomenon. Um, they seem to be in this little bubble, and the way that I describe it is that they've got this sense of fatalism about them, um, where especially if they might have come from a not necessarily a bad environment, but just sort of an environment where they believe that like nobody really understood them, and they were sort of ostracized for being who they are, and then they sort of grow up and they develop these very ISFP sort of personality quirks. Um, and when you watch this Drew Barrymore video with Machine Gun Kelly, like immediately he comes out and he starts telling her, "Hey, I'm having a really bad day. I'm sorry if I come across as insular," I think is the way he put it. being very dramatic, very sort of woe is me, but also sort of being apologetic about it. Um, and so he goes into this sort of FI hole, right? And he's like doing her nails. I put a link to the video below. And so he's doing this sort of SE stuff to sort of keep himself engaged in the moment, I guess. But also going down that sort of FI pity party hole. And Drew Barrymore, who is I sort of read as being more of an INFP, ENFP, she's trying to share in the moment, like, hey, I had a really tough time. And she had sort of this notorious divorce and very troubled history that thankfully she's gotten out of. But, she's trying to connect with him. And she's like, well, I've had a very bad time too, but here's the things that sort of helped me. Have you thought about this? And he doesn't even want to think about it. He's just like in this little bubble of his own. And he doesn't want to think about the fact that maybe there's another way of looking at things, or maybe there's another way of approaching things. It's just like, no, you know I'm in my little self-pity bubble, and I don't need. And when you sort of take the combination of the FI, the SE, this is how I read the world, this is how the world is, and then you have that introverted intuition in your third function as an ISFP, and it just creates this like solid, almost stubborn, unshakable perception of the world, right? Which I think leads to that fatalism, right? Because they're unipolar. And so it's hard for them to sort of focus on alternatives, right? Or other things that they could be doing out there that might make, their life a little bit easier, or might not be as, daunting as the world, around them. And so you see it in me, you see it in tools, Maynard, I forget his last name, but the lead singer from Tool, who is another one of these classic pity party FI guys. Um, and you see it in Machine Gun Kelly, you see it and then also in the ISFP women. And and it's not necessarily all the ISFP men, because there's some that are a little bit, you could tell they probably had maybe a little bit more of a understanding environment, that where their dominant FI might have been a little bit more encouraged or not as ostracized. But for anybody where they sort of grew up and they sort of felt like the odd person out because of this heavy FI, just, put all those components together: the heavy FI, the SE, and the introverted intuition, and then the lack of extroverted intuition. And you just get this sense of fatalism, like this is the way the world is. And the other thing they point out, so especially in ISFP males, especially sort of these, you know, um, sort of Debbie Downer. I'm trying to find a way of like describing melancholy, I guess might be a way, but of describing it. They tend to be, I've noticed this in ISFPs that I know personally. They tend to be into like very like morose stuff, like death, pictures of death, like, and not just like the concept of death, but just like, I mean, they'll get tattoos of like bones and skulls, and you know, um, and they'll collect bones, and they'll collect, like Kurt Cobain was talking about how he goes to this medical store and buys like, replicas. I'm hoping, of like fetuses, and just things like that. And I think it's because they've got this like heavy FI stuff going on, where they might have had sort of a troubled childhood or a troubled upbringing, or they just sort of felt ostracized, and they're just looking for some sort of physical thing in the world to sort of reify those feelings, or sort of something that they could point to in the physical world that says that's how I feel, right? Um, and so these ISFP males, especially, they get into this very sort of morbid death kind of stuff because that's kind of what's on their mind all the time, right? Um, and then again, and then with that third function, that introverted intuition. So getting back to sort of the theory here, they will see themselves as being very intuitive. And ISFP females do the same thing. And in the Megan Fox video on Typebook, they also typed her as an ISFP, and I think she is. Um, and she's also pointing to this very supernatural type of stuff. I'm going to avoid using the word metaphysical because that has its own sort of meaning in MBTI socionics world, but more of supernatural, right? Like, so tarot cards, astrology, that kind of stuff. But ghosts, a lot of ISFPs like are into, witchcraft and Wicca, but they will always tell you it's like, oh, but it's not like, Hollywood witchcraft. It's like real witchcraft. It's like, a connection with nature, and it's the way the Druids did it, or, the Vikings did it. Or tarot cards, astronomy. And again, it's sort of this intuitive belief in something, but it's tied to something physical in the way that astrology, um, or tarot cards are tied to something physical, like the planets, like the alignment of the planets, or the specific cards that you're being dealt, or ghosts, or people who are into Wicca. There's this deep connection to nature, but again, it's very physical, right? It's not, and it's not religious in the way that other types might, like an SJ type might see religion more as sort of these sort of just general rules, principles, guidelines, things to sort of live your life by. And they don't really need to point to anything physical so much. Yeah, there's crosses and there's rituals, and there's the blood and the bread and all that kind of stuff, but they probably came up with that stuff for all the SPs. Right? All the SJs, like, they just need to know what the rules are. Right? Like, they don't need all the crosses and the crucifixes and the bread and the wine and all the sort of physical embodiments of the religion or the tradition. They just need to know, what are the rules, like, what are we supposed to do? More of an SI kind of feel. But the SPs, they want to tie it to something physical, right? And so again, they've got that third function, introverted intuition, where they feel like they're being intuitive in again, the general sense of the word, that like they just have a feeling about the way things are. And part of it might be they're just sort of conflating their FI with what we would in the MBTI world would call intuition. They see their introverted feeling as sort of an understanding about the world through their feelings, right? And so they might be conflating it, but they also come across as sort of your MBTI intuitives, because they are into sort of pattern seeking and understanding sort of core truths about the world. But again, they do it in this kind of selfish way, right? It's like they've got no problem sharing it with you, but they're sort of doing it for their own sort of inner self growth, and they're not really doing it at large, for everybody. And really, they just don't want you interfering with it, right? But again, they want to tie it to something physical, whether it's the planets aligning, or a certain type of plant or tree if they're into the nature stuff, candles, all that kind of just ritualistic stuff, that's out there. That's what sort of drives their intuition. And so they're using that intuition to sort of figure out patterns of, different star signs or zodiac signs, or, what different tarot cards are supposed to mean. Like, what's the meaning behind, this particular tarot card, or what's the meaning behind some sort of astrological or zodiac sign. And so when you're interacting with them, they come across as, what we would normally think of in MBTI world or socionics world as intuitives, lead intuitives. And so I think a lot of ISFPs get mistaken for INFPs or maybe INFJs, because they do have that sort of woo-woo kind of, I'm trying to figure out the deeper meaning of things about them. But because they're NE polar, it's this very, I don't want to say unique, or I don't want to say weird, but it's more like unique way of dealing with introverted intuition, because they aren't seeing the other possibilities. And and it's guided by these sort of SP objects out in the world that have their own sort of meaning that they're assigning to them. And so it creates this sense of fatalism, right? And this sense of like, especially, again, depending on the background they grew up in, they might have this like view of the world that, everything's shitty, people are shitty, and that's just the way it is, right? And I'm here, and if you don't see it the same way I do, then you've just had the veil of ignorance pulled over your eyes, right? Like, I'm here to tell you, because again, I got that FI where I have this general feeling about, the world, and its pluses and its minuses. And there's probably a lot more minuses to a lot of these people, ISFPs in particular. And I can point to, real life experience that I've had with people being shitty all around me. And then throw in that third, introverted intuition, which is very personal to them. And like, they've got it all figured out, right? They've got the whole world figured out, and they've got just the way that people are figured out. And so you get this fatalism, and you get this sort of living in a bubble and not looking to, find any way to improve the situation. Like, I have a very good ISFP female friend, and she is just very fatalistic. And every time you try to give her sort of some INFJ advice, or just even some practical TE type of advice, it's very just like, nope, the world just sucks, and my luck sucks, and everything sucks, and no matter what I try, it's just gonna suck, right? And that, to me, I think is just very NE polar. And I think, NE is sort of the source of hope in a lot of people, because they can see the way that the world is, but they can also see the way the world might be if you did X, Y, and Z, right? Where a lot of ISFPs are just sort of missing that. Now, again, I think there might be sort of a environmental thing leading to this. If you're an ISFP and you grew up in a much more sort of accepting community, then you might be living in a more optimistic bubble, right? But you're not going to see a whole lot of like musicians and artists and famous people who have that sort of optimistic ISFP bubble, because they're not as cool, right? Or they're not as like intriguing to watch, right? The ISFP musicians, the Kurt Cobains or the Machine Gun Kellys or whoever, they're a phenomenon to watch. I'd probably put Trent Reznor in there too. He comes across as very that sort of morbid ISFP. The world just sucks, and that fatalistic sort of view. Okay. The other thing that I've noticed is that ISFPs tend to pair off together a lot, right? So you've got Machine Gun Kelly and Megyn Kelly, and just realized that or Megan Fox, right? Sorry, not Megan Kelly, but I guess maybe she's Megan Kelly if they're married. But anyways, so they're married, and the ISFP girl that I know, she's had sort of an on again, off again boyfriend, and he's clearly an ISFP too, and he's very theatrical, and he's into performing in the arts, but also just very macabre stuff. And it's very death related, a lot of guts, a lot of gore, that kind of stuff. They're both into horror movies, all that, and she would tell me like he's exactly like me, right? And so they tend to latch on. And my observation is they tend to latch on to the other people who are also ISFPs who feel like they were always ostracized and misunderstood by the world. And finally, they have somebody where they can do this sort of like us against the world kind of thing, right? Now, of course, it's always very volatile. It's always very fiery. They're always yelling at each other. They're always getting in fights. But there's that passion, that strong FI passion, and that sort of, that any polar almost makes it like it's almost impossible for them to see themselves with anybody else. I can imagine Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love are probably both ISFPs too. I mean, don't hold me to it, but that's just sort of the sense that I get with these sort of melancholy, us against the world. Sid and Nancy, for those of you who remember the Sex Pistols or the movie about Sid Vicious, Sid and Nancy is probably another classic example. Natural born killers, just these ISFPs that just gravitate towards each other because nobody else in the world understands them, and they just can't imagine themselves being with anybody else, kind of thing, right? Okay, so if you come across somebody and they're they sort of fancy themselves as being very intuitive, and and again, it's usually the people who aren't religious but they're spiritual, right? They're into astrology, or they're into crystals, or they're into tarot cards, but it's something physical that they're tying their intuitive knowledge about the world to. And then they also might come across as very fatalistic because they don't have that any or at least they're any polar. They've all got it, but they don't want to put a lot of energy into it. And so they just sort of refuse to accept that there's just other ways that things could be, right? That it sucks for them, and it's always going to suck for them, right? Given if they've had a hard background or an ostracized background. Okay, so let's see here. Other types. I mean, I'm not going to really go through all of them because I really haven't thought through it that much. I just see it so much in the ISFPs. And I kind of see it in the INFJs because I kind of just have a general personal sense of what it's like. But in the ESTJs and ESFJs, this is another group where I've sort of noticed it, where they're sort of the opposite, right, of the ISFPs. So I'm thinking about ESFJ in particular, and I've told this story before on another video, but she was in this situation where somebody was obviously tracking her car, like always knew when she was at work and always knew when she wasn't home. And we just sort of like text her randomly, be like, "Hey, where are you? Why aren't you at home?" And she'd just be like, "How does this person know where I am all the time?" And to everybody else, it was kind of obvious that, she was somehow being tracked, but, she just didn't, she was bipolar, so she couldn't just believe it without seeing any actual real evidence, right? And so eventually she gets her car checked out, and lo and behold, they find a tracker on it. And so now she's, completely convinced, right? But it wasn't until somebody actually showed her physical evidence that she was willing to believe it, right? Even though everybody else who wasn't unipolar around her was just like, yeah, it's pretty clear what's going on here. Um, Now, the funny thing is, this particular person, again, sees herself as intuitive. Like she, but in a kind of a detective kind of way, because when she found out all this stuff and like did her little detective work, you know, she was eventually able to prove to herself that, such and such was the case. But it wasn't until she actually saw the physical evidence that she proved it. But because she went through all these little steps to get there, and because she sort of thought about all the different possibilities, she saw herself as being quote unquote intuitive. And again, not in the MBTI sense, but in sort of the general sense that the normal the normal population would use it. Um, and so again, with ESTJs and ESFJs, they might say things like, I make my decisions, based off of my gut feeling. My gut feeling is that we should do this, right? And again, they might be conflating FI with intuition. Um, but they do kind of see themselves as intuitive in a way. But not in that sort of supernatural sense that the ISFPs see themselves as intuitive, but more in sort of like the Sherlock Holmesy kind of way. Like they can do detective work and they can figure out like what happened and put all the puzzle pieces together. And I understand that that's a little NI as well, but to them, it's like they're going to go out and they're going to gather all the evidence, right? And they're going to do all the research. And I think that's sort of an any sort of exploring, right? Like they're going to, sit online and look up all the records or whatever, right? And just sort of sift through the evidence, right? Or sift through the data. And then they're going to find the smoking gun and solve whatever problem it is. Um, and I think they see that the ESTJs and the ESFJs see that as quote unquote being intuitive, right? Like following your nose in the way that Sherlock Holmes would. Like, I've got some sort of intuition that, such and such is the case. So I'm going to drill down on this and figure it out. As opposed to just like, you know, the introverted intuition types where it's in their third slot, like the ISFPs, where they just have this, they feel like they have this deep connection to the world and this deep understanding of the world that other people don't see. ESTJs and ESFJs want none of that, right? They're unipolar in that sense. Like they don't care about deeper connections or deeper understandings. Hey, somebody posted a question. So I'm going to detract here. How does an NE dom relate to NE polar individuals? All right. So we're talking ENTPs and ENFPs dealing with the NE polars. So the ISFPs and the ISTPs. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. Maybe watch that video that I have linked down below with Drew Barrymore and Machine Gun Kelly. And there were two things that I noticed from it. And I don't know if Drew Barrymore is necessarily NE dominant, but it's either dominant or second. She's either an INFP or an ENFP. But you could see the sort of interaction with using NE with somebody who's not who is NE polar, right? So Machine Gun Kelly's NE polar because he's an ISFP, and she's trying to get him. She's basically saying, "Look, I was in a bad place too." She was like in a notorious bad place for years, and she got out of it by doing these different things and, surrounding herself with the right people and moving away from LA and, somewhere more peaceful, and and you could tell that she's just trying to get him to think like, hey, maybe if I'm not feeling great and I've got this FI pity party going on, maybe there's something I can do different that will get me out of this funk, right? Where it's just going over his head, right? Like he doesn't, and I also noticed that he doesn't really ask anything about her, right? Like he doesn't just sit there and say, "Oh, okay, well, what did you do?" And how did that work out? And like he showed zero interest in it, right? Like he just wanted to live in his little pity party bubble. Um, and he didn't want to engage on that NE, like, let's talk about different possibilities. Let's talk about, you know, um, different ways of looking at it, different perspectives, or alternatives that, people with NE will want to engage with each other and try to, hash out ideas, right? Because they might be looking for information for themselves, right? Um, where if you're any polar, again, the sense I get is just that fatalism where they just don't even want to think that there's any alternative. And if other people like an ENTP or a ENFP is, trying to tell them, look, there's a different way of thinking about this. An ENTP is more likely to just be like, oh, you're being like completely illogical. Like, the world was really that bad, then, you know, we as a species would have committed suicide eons ago and we would have, stopped propagating anyways, right? And so it can't be that bad, right? There's some sort of logical explanation of why it's not as shitty as the ISFPs think it is. Where the ENFPs are going to be more like, hey, yeah, the world sucks, but it doesn't have to, maybe there's some other things that you could do or we could do to make it better. And I think that would be sort of the interaction. But in a way, it's almost done in vain unless the ISFP is just willing to put in the work, the cognitive resources into sort of exploring the NE. But if you get one of these really fatalistic ones, it's tough. It's really tough. But welcome. Okay. So back to the ESTJs, ESFJs. Again, they see themselves as kind of these funny little detectives, and they're going to figure out and they're going to use their quote unquote intuition in sort of this Columbo, Sherlock Holmes kind of style where, they're going to map out the metaphysical universe and figure out what exactly happened. But they're going to be looking for hard, actual physical evidence, right? Because they're not going to trust anything, that's just pure NI. They're only going to trust, sort of an SI type of experience. Like, haha, there's the tracker in my car, right? I mean, that's kind of an SE experience that gets wrapped into their SI knowledge about the world, right? And so now they know that, through their experience that such and such is the case, right? And they've cracked the case and they've solved it. Um, and so that's another way that people will sort of, in outside of MBTI and socionics world will sort of describe intuition as just sort of following your nose and following the clues. So again, my ESFJ friend, clearly an ESFJ, but if you ask her, she really thinks of herself as being intuitive. Like she really thinks she'd be like this great detective or, and she probably would be. Like I think ESFJs, or ESTJs probably do make really good detectives because they don't get tripped up on their NI and like they actually try to find real evidence before, coming to any sort of conclusions. And if you're a real detective and you're trying to put somebody in jail, you have to have evidence. It can't just be getting up on the stand and saying, well, my NI tells me he did it. Right? Which is like totally what, an INFJ or an INTJ would do if they were a detective. So that, so if you're an INFJ or you're an INTJ, don't go be a detective because you're going to get put on the stand and you're going to have to convince everybody, well, I just know he did it, clearly. And if everybody had the same NI that I did, then you'd all understand. Um, okay. So that's my third function theory. I might go through the different types. And if you're interested in any particular type, let me know. Um, Others that come to mind, INTJs, ISTJs. So, their introverted feeling is third. And I don't get the sense that they tend to fancy themselves as feelers. Because I do think there's sort of this overall bias where people just want to be thinkers. So if they come out as thinkers, they're happy with that. Um, but that being said, a lot of ISTJs or INTJs that I know, they certainly, you know, they certainly think a lot of their opinions on things, and they will certainly share their opinions. Like, I just always use the example of this INTJ, or it could be an ISTJ friend of mine, and anytime we're at the bar and a song comes on that he doesn't like he instantly within like 10 seconds has to tell you how much he doesn't like the song. I was like, okay, we get it. Like, we don't like the music here. We understand. Um, and and again, they just don't have that effy counterbalance that's reading the room and sending them feedback, letting them know, like, okay, we get it, we understand what your opinion is, you don't have to tell us every song. um or just really just sharing their opinions on everything, and a lot of it is just sort of like, people don't understand because they're stupid, or that kind of attitude about things. And so I don't think they would necessarily, if you ask them if they're a feeler, they probably wouldn't want to say that they're a feeler, in the sense that like ISFPs will say that they're intuitives. But they certainly don't hold back on their opinion about things or people or shows or movies. Um, and so you could see that they have a respect or a some sort of they hold their opinion in high regard, right? They certainly hold it in high regard. And usually, it's based off of an opinion. Like, you like a song or you don't like a song. But then they'll try to come up with some sort of logical argument of why that song is a bad song, and not a good song. And that's just their TITE coming in and trying to come up with some sort of explanation. But really, at its core, is they just like it or they don't like it, pure FI. Um, Okay. So I think that's really about it. That the ISTJ was the other, or INTJ was the other example that I was thinking of where their third function seems to be sort of defining them in a weird way. They come across as very opinionated, at least in my experience. Um, and and maybe not so much in like professional settings, but in social settings. Like, they will certainly let you know their opinion of a person or a song or a movie or whatever is going on. Okay, I think that's about it. Leave me comments if you want me to go more into this. I probably will once I sort of hash it out a little bit more. But I was on this ISFP kick and just thought I'd lay down some thoughts. Okay, talk to everybody later. Bye.